we're going to see different forms of ownership than we have, because I think that idea of owning, that $1 million unit isn't going to work for everybody. There's a lot of people who simply cannot make that work. So I think some proportional ownership, I think, is where I think there will be increasing opportunity and demand for something like that.
Welcome to People Who Perform, the Real Estate Careers Podcast. Each episode will bring you conversations from business leaders and up-and-coming stars in the commercial real estate industry in Canada. Our guests will share their unique career journeys, passions, and advice on what it takes to be successful in this industry. This podcast is brought to you by Highview Partners, connecting people who perform in Canadian real estate.
Hello and welcome back to People Who Perform, the Real Estate Careers Podcast. I'm your host, Nicola Denning-Millar, and today we're diving into a crucial topic that affects communities far and wide: affordable housing. With housing costs on the rise and the challenges that many individuals and families face in finding homes that fit their budgets, we're taking a closer look at the importance of affordable housing solutions. Joining us in today's episode is Heather Tremain, CEO of Options for Homes, Canada's largest non-profit developer of affordable housing ownership. Heather is a city builder with a passion for social purpose real estate and sustainable development, and she's helped achieve change to both public policy and funding in support of this segment of the housing spectrum. Under her leadership, Options have grown their development pipeline to over $1 billion worth of assets, and they work exclusively on making home ownership more affordable. In this episode today, we'll be discussing the current state of affordable housing, its significance in creating equitable communities, and the innovative approaches that are required to address this pressing issue. So whether you're passionate about real estate development or you're simply curious about the impact of affordable housing, you're in for an enlightening conversation. Thank you so much for being here, Heather. I really appreciate it.
It's great to be with you today.
So I'm going to start by asking you to please share some of the milestones or experiences that have shaped your journey into the field of real estate development.
Sure. I started on this path with a master's in architecture at UBC many moons ago. And I was quite interested and motivated by social housing. And I saw that, a lot of the housing that we were building in terms of social housing wasn't great. It wasn't really dignified housing. And I had an arts degree, and I was looking for what it was that I could do that was meaningful to me and maybe made a contribution. And so dawned on me that maybe architecture was a route into, to making some kind of contribution, and again, with a very large interest in housing. So that's kind of the first step in my journey. In architecture school, I got quite interested in green building and actually started a green building consulting company that was called Resource Rethinking Building. We were one of the first green building consulting companies. We really helped, to some extent, mainstream green building in Vancouver. We did a lot of first projects. We did the first LEED high-rise in Canada. We wrote green building guidelines for Simon Fraser University that was building a large residential development. We worked for UBC. I think we worked for every major developer, helping them adopt green practices. And then over time, we said, my business partner had been a developer, and he said, why don't we look at doing development? And so then we pivoted into doing development. We did some of our own market projects, and then we did a large project at Simon Fraser University that was a real landmark project in that area in terms of affordable housing. So that was my first real foray into development. And after about 8 or 9 years, we wound down the green building consulting company. And I took off to Harvard. I was offered a fellowship there. And there I kind of explored a bunch of ideas and opportunities, and then came back to Vancouver to act as a consultant, really working with nonprofits that owned real estate and acting as an advisor to them, because oftentimes they have significant real estate assets but don't have expertise on their board or in-house, and they needed some support to make critical decisions. So I worked in that capacity, being a kind of trusted advisor, really. And after doing that for a while, I pivoted. I decided I really wanted to go back into development. And that was which was when I was working on raising equity and trying to get something off the ground that married the model that we had done up at Simon Fraser, and then also the model that I work with now at Options. That's the road. And as I was raising capital, but really seeing that there wasn't a lot of political support for what I was trying to do in affordable homeownership in Vancouver at the time, this opportunity arose at Options for Homes. So that's my journey so far in real estate development.
That's great. I mean, what motivated you to pursue a career in not-for-profit real estate development? Like, who was your inspiration? What was your inspiration?
To some extent, I had started doing this affordable homeownership work in Vancouver at Simon Fraser University. So that kind of lent itself, probably to a leaning towards more, nonprofit ways of operating. It also leans more towards the social aims of a project than just the pure profit aims. I mentioned that I had this fellowship at Harvard. It was an interesting year because you had this opportunity to stop and think about what you wanted to do. And as I mentioned, after that, I went back and worked as a trusted advisor for mostly nonprofits. And that was the first time I'd been on nonprofit boards, but that I really worked with nonprofits. And I think I saw some of the advantages of the kind of nonprofit world and also some of the challenges of it. And I think what was interesting when I moved to Options is that Options is a nonprofit, but we actually act like a business. So we have to have all the kind of efficiency and professionalism of a business, but we have this nonprofit aim, which is, to help people to become homeowners. So I think for me, it was, especially at Options, I get the advantage of doing interesting development work that's extremely, it's as complicated as every other development project and as business oriented, but the result that I'm producing and that my team is producing is different. It's really that outcome that I think drew me into it, but with the marriage of all the other complexities and interest of running a business.
Well, I know from previous conversations that we've had that when you actually joined Options for Homes, you started in the development and planning division, but the end goal was always to become the CEO.
Yeah, that was when I was hired. I was the succession plan, I guess, if you will, for the founder. And it was a little bit of a try before you buy, where I think they wanted to make sure I was the right fit in the organization. It was someone who had founded the organization, done a lot of heavy lifting. So that made sense as a part of that succession planning.
Can you tell us a little bit about the owner? What sort of inspired him to set up the company in the first place?
Yeah, so his name is Mike LeBay, and when he founded Options back in the mid 90s, the idea was that's when the federal government was really pulling out of the funding of affordable housing. He had developed a number of co-ops and nonprofit rental, and all of a sudden this government money was leaving the space. The government money that left the space then is what's creating the housing problem now, because we had years and years of disinvestment. But at the time, his thinking was, how can I create an organization that will be sustainable without government funding? So in the model, we actually generate proceeds from our unit sales that come back in to a fund and then are able to fund more units. So we've created he created a bit of a virtuous circle in the model that allows us to be relatively, I wouldn't say free from government funding, but we do not require government grants to operate. So in that way, we're very unique from every other nonprofit housing provider probably in the country. So I think that was some of it. And then he also went on a tour to South Africa and saw what they were doing in South Africa, which was they were providing loans to people to help them to become homeowners, and they were securing them second mortgages. So that idea kind of found its way and is an important part of our model as well. So I think it was a bit of this desire to be independent and not reliant on government funding, and then sourcing some interesting ideas outside in terms of global applications of affordable housing.
Let's talk a little bit then about options for homes. So, are you able to sort of provide an overview of the company's mission and really the types of real estate development projects that you specialize in?
Options for Homes is the largest nonprofit developer of attainable homeownership units in the country. We've been around since 1994. We've built over 3,300 units, largely in the GTA. We are a condo builder, so we're really just building residential units, and our mission is really to help people to become homeowners. And you might ask why that's important. And for us, why that's important is that what we're trying to do is help address wealth inequality. For a lot of Canadians, a lot of younger people today, they may have parents who owned homes and are therefore able to help with a down payment. But there's a significant number of people who don't have that access to that wealth and families. And so typically it's much more challenging for them to get into an ownership position. So what we're trying to do is give people that opportunity to come into ownership, which is really one of the easiest ways for people to build some wealth for themselves. It's either you own a home or you create some mobility through education. So that's what we're trying to do. Is we say we're trying to put our finger on the scale of wealth inequality by boosting people up who would typically not be able to afford to own. And we know that changes the trajectory of families. Their children will be more likely to own. Their children will probably likely get kind of better education. Oftentimes they get better jobs. So this is this real opportunity to kind of create a strong direction for a family and also give them the kind of resilience that many other families have who own homes. When there's some bump in the road financially, oftentimes people are able to use equity in their homes or borrow against their homes to start a business. So it's really giving people access to the kind of opportunity for financial resiliency. I think that's really what we're trying to do at Options.
And in terms of the demographic of the end user, I mean, when I think of the types of people that would benefit from what you're offering, I think of sort of, lower to middle income households. I think of immigrants coming to Canada or even young people. A lot of young people want to live in Toronto. They don't want to live in suburbs.
Yeah.
Or teachers, nurses, firefighters,
Mm-hmm.
who are working in downtown Toronto but are having to live in the suburbs and commute in, which I don't feel is acceptable.
Yeah.
So are those the kinds of people, or are there other groups as well?
Yeah, no, you've hit a lot of the groups. We often say that we're providing workforce housing.
Mm.
It's sometimes the young professional who's getting started. And those are the groups you want to keep in the city to kind of keep the kind of professional skills and creative forces of the city. We also have a lot of single parent families, and that becomes a very critical thing for them to give their kids security of tenure. And one of the things that we did recently, we did our first social impact study. What we found was that 56% of our purchasers identify as BIPOC. and coming from BIPOC communities. And that was very interesting for us. And we had the sense that that was the case, that the kind of, that those numbers would be high, but we finally were able to kind of prove it out for ourselves. What's interesting is that a lot of communities where homeownership is kind of significantly lower than the kind of white homeownership is. So, 72% of white adults who are able to be homeowners or of age to be homeowners are homeowners. Whereas in the Black community, that's probably 44%, and the numbers in the Indigenous community are somewhat similar. And what we found is that we were actually able to reach kind of more significant numbers in Black community, in Indigenous communities. So that's something we're actually proud of at Options, is that these are groups that typically don't have the same access to homeownership. Maybe it's because their parents didn't own. Oftentimes incomes, there's a difference for some of these racialized communities with their incomes. So that for us is actually something where we feel like we're giving people a pathway to that kind of financial resiliency that we think is important for people.
That's fantastic. So while we're talking about it, I mean, how do you actually determine the income requirements and the eligibility criteria for the end users who are wanting to purchase with Options for homes?
Yeah, we go about this maybe a little bit counterintuitively. We price our units and they are priced at market. And then we are providing people with down payment support. So that's typically somewhere between 10 and 15% of the value of the unit we will lend to our purchasers. They need to come to the table with 5% down payment, and then they're going to get the mortgage for the residual amount of a first mortgage. So what we do is we ask people to go and get a mortgage. So we understand what they're able to support, and then we work backwards. We say, you're going to put 5% down, your mortgage is this much. And so there's a residual amount that tells us how much they need. So we work with people on an individual basis to determine how much they need and then how much we're able to provide to them. So we're trying to fill that gap, if you will. And sometimes we have funds from other sources, like the City of Toronto has been great in terms of partnering with us, and they sometimes bring additional capital to the table so we can increase the amount of the down payment that we're providing to people. So that's how we go at it, is let's see what you can afford. Let's see what the cost is, and let's see if we can fill that gap, in essence. And then the flip side is if there is any money that's provided by the city, they do have income thresholds that depend on the size of the unit and the size of the family. And then we work within those thresholds to determine if that person is eligible for those funds.
My understanding is that more than, I believe it's 70% of units are sold, several years prior to the project's breaking ground. But obviously in the years that follow after the purchase, and particularly in today's climate of rising construction, labour costs and so forth, where do these costs get absorbed? Like, are they passed on to the end user? Because assuming that they've qualified for a certain amount and wouldn't be able to go above that. So how does that work, Heather?
In some cases, some of those costs can be passed on to the end user. So if development charges from the city change in that period of time, oftentimes that increase will get passed on to the purchaser. But for the most part, the majority of the costs, you've set a price. And so once you start to sell at that price, you have to have some assurity that you can actually deliver those units at that price. So, and that's why in the last few years, you've seen these cancellations, because projects sell at a certain level, construction costs escalate significantly, and the cost to deliver the unit is now significantly more than what these, or equal to what these people paid for it. So the project is no longer viable. But what we do is we have a long-standing relationship with Delterra, which is the third-party construction arm of Tridel. And we work very closely with them on our project costing, on our kind of forecasting, and then sort of fixing the construction costs, so that we have not been in that position where we've ever had to do that. But it is it is a very big issue right now in the marketplace. The construction cost increases, interest rate increases, development charge increases. These are all, many of the factors that are really, you'll see, slowing up the industry right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's a risky business, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a very risky business.
Now, in terms of unique challenges and opportunities that you encounter in not-for-profit real estate development, how do they compare to the for-profit sector?
We have many of the same challenges as the for-profit sector because in some ways, even though we are a nonprofit, we do everything a for-profit group does, as well as serving the customers, and often doing a lot of financial literacy with our purchasers. So we have all the same challenges. One of our kind of challenges that might be a bit more acute is just the securing land. It's difficult to compete with a market developer in many cases. And what's been interesting for us is that we often would buy land that was in kind of maybe let's call them emerging submarkets. They weren't the areas that everybody else was working in. But what we have found in the last while is that other groups have followed us in. So we did a project at Maine and Danforth, and nobody was building condos around there. Now that whole area is in development. We bought in Weston, and now that whole area, I think there's 20 development applications. We're just finishing the first condo in Weston in probably 30 years. So that, finding those next pockets that are the emerging markets, that's challenging because everybody is looking for those now in a way that they weren't maybe a few years ago. And then I think we're more constrained in terms of accessing capital than a for-profit developer because of our structure. And our financing tends to be a bit more complex. We have a number of layers in our financing that make it a bit more complicated. But these are all solvable problems, really.
I was reading yesterday that obviously the city owns lots of real estate, well over like $30 billion by all accounts, and including obviously lots of what is now empty office buildings since COVID. So what is the plan to repurpose some of that land into affordable housing units, and how quickly do you think that can alleviate the housing crisis?
I think we saw the release of a number of sites under Housing Now. I forget how many there were. I think there were close to 10 sites. So you're starting to see some of those projects come online, which were all city-owned lands, but often quite complicated pieces of lands, where the TTC might have had some facilities. So some of those are starting to move forward, and I do hope that we're going to see more of those, and maybe slightly simpler sites, because those complex sites just take more time to work through the issues of. So, and then I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. There's a lot of talk about these conversions of office buildings to some form of residential, and I think that people who really understand that know that there are some of those buildings that will work. But a lot of them likely won't work because the floor plate is too deep, and there will be some challenges to make them actually really livable. But there definitely are some of those that will work in that conversion, and I think we may see some of those because I think the office market is definitely shifted. So I think, hopefully we will continue to see this moving forward with the city, kind of new sites being brought to the table. And I mean, I think we saw this week, the federal cabinet was meeting, housing was forefront on the agenda. I think we know we're in a full-blown crisis now. There's been lots of people ringing bells for a long time, but we know we're in a full-blown crisis. So I hope we'll see some bigger shifts, like the removal of HST for rental and things like that, that would allow some rental projects to get going. I do hope we're going to see some of those. And I heard somebody describe it like we have to treat it like it's a war. Like, in the Second World War, we pulled together. I mean, I wasn't around then, but the story goes that we pulled together. There was a real focus on solving the problems. There was sort of a kind of a kind of not quite singular focus, but a clear focus. and everything was on the table. And I think I hope that will be the take at all levels of government to really move this forward.
Well, I know Olivia Chow has promised 25,000 units on city-owned land. So it'd be interesting to see when and where those units are going to be developed.
Yeah.
So the other challenge I've heard many times is that it's really, really difficult for builders and developers to navigate sort of complex mazes of processes that they have to go through to obtain zoning bylaw amendments in Toronto. And I've heard that there's often like a 30-40 month wait on average. So despite being a not-for-profit, do you find the same challenges on the timeframes? Like, do you get any kind of advantage because you're not for profit? I mean, and also how can the bureaucracy be reduced so that housing can actually get built?
We don't have big advantages. There are some programs that I think are meant to speed up the process. I would say historically on most of our projects we didn't see a difference. There are some processes now that are meant to be speeding up the process, and we're starting to see it on one project in particular where we do feel like we're getting kind of more attention more quickly from the city. It is a long process. It's extremely technical. I think for every project, we probably submit about 20 or 25 professional reports, along with hundreds of pages of drawings that all have to be reviewed multiple times by the city. One of the interesting ideas, I've heard people say is at some level, what can happen in the city is you submit a set of drawings and or study, and the city makes comments on it, and then oftentimes much later they'll come back to that drawing or that report and make new comments and open up new issues. And almost it would be good to have a more streamlined approach where they get one chance to have these comments. So give all the comments and the fulsome comments. And after that, you can assume that you're on the right course rather than this kind of very iterative process where sometimes issues crop up oftentimes at the 11th hour and you're trying to solve them under like extreme deadline to get something, finally approved. So that's one of the ideas that I have heard, which I think it would sort of hold, and there would be an accountability for the city staff to kind of ensure that they do a very fulsome review the first time. It might take a little bit longer the first time, but it would probably save time in the end in these processes.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, obviously, options would be working with various partners. What would you say are some of the more unique partnerships that you've been involved with?
Yeah, we've had a few. We've done a few projects with church groups where we have, in one case, we purchased the parking lot around their building and built a building, and then they received the payment for that land value and they were able to refurbish their church. We have a site right now in Don Mills where we will develop the whole site, and the church we will build a facility for the church in the building. So some of those have been interesting partnerships, and I think quite aligned values wise. And we have a really wonderful partner in Tridel. Their construction arm builds for us, but they really do act. I sometimes joke that they're like our big brother. So they kind of have their eyes out for us. They have many times they have, if they have a site that doesn't work for them, they will pass it on to us. They also, because we're a relatively small shop in the world of development, they will support us if we have, particular issues or questions or where they have more depth of knowledge. They're quite willing to meet with us and help us, work through problems. And that's enormously valuable. And in all, they've been a kind of a tremendous partner. And really, options wouldn't be where it is without them.
Now, you were saying earlier on that you have education in architecture. I believe you did an undergraduate, you went to Harvard for design. What role does design and architecture play in creating quality, affordable housing?
I think it's quite important. I think back to the first project I ever worked on as a development manager, and it was at Simon Fraser University, and it was a 4-story wood frame building. It was stacked townhouses. It was so efficient in its design and had this exterior walkway. I mean, it was a beautiful building, and it sort of had a courtyard form. The design and the kind of creativity of the design team, we ended up creating this incredibly efficient building, which meant that when we went to sell it, it was high net saleable area, which every developer loves. It also had this great courtyard where we actually did build a daycare in it as well. And I think that created a great community. And I think whether it's affordable housing or, market housing, community is incredibly important. I think we created this building that had this place where it was lots of kids and lots of families lived there. And, there was this amazing kind of open space in the middle with play facilities. And I think that also just helped create this tremendous community. It's funny, on a much larger scale, that's what we're doing now in this site in Scarborough. That we hope to bring to market next year, but that one is 800 units, and we've built it in such a way, or designed it in such a way, that it has this great kind of courtyard space or outdoor space that all the buildings kind of surround it. It's going to be a great place for kids to play, and you can imagine the kind of like the dogs roaming free there. And ultimately, I think that whether it's market housing or affordable housing, that's incredibly important. That kind of livability, the sense of community, the sense of connectedness of your neighbors, that just brings, it's so important to our well-being. And so I think that's one of the things that design can really bring if it's done well. I think in affordable housing, one of the things we really focus on is we want you to have a quality home. We don't ever want someone to look at our buildings and say they're affordable. So we tend to be really quite focused on, can we choose a slightly different material that might be more cost effective, but isn't going to give the sense that it's, nobody's going to look at it and kind of, in air quotes, think it's an affordable housing project. And that's one of the ways that, one of the huge benefits that we found in working with Tridel and Delterra is that they're very good in sort of supporting that decision making. So in the end, our purchasers get a kind of Tridel quality building in all the critical ways, but maybe not quite as luxurious, but still high quality.
Do you find that most homeowners still have that very traditional expectation of what the interior space should offer? And what I mean by that is I went to Bisno's housing conference a couple of months ago, and there were a panel of developers who said that their design teams are now really appealing to a new generation of people who no longer expect things like an office or a dining room or a guest room. They would prefer to save on the cost of their unit and pass those costs on to the developer and actually use the condo's amenities. So do you find that homeowners that they're on board with that? Because there's a little bit of an oxymoron, isn't there, between we want a large space but we want it to be affordable. So can developers appeal to a new generation of people who thought that they needed those things, but they've actually realized that they don't?
I think what's interesting, what we're finding is people do want some kind of working space outside of their homes. So what we're doing in the project in Scarborough is we're starting to create kind of shared working spaces in the amenity spaces. Maybe not officially co-working spaces, but some kind of shared facility where people can go and work outside, book and work outside of their homes. So I think that is one thing we heard. We also heard people say they wanted outdoor space, they wanted balconies, they wanted, especially I think probably as a result of COVID, those were some of the things that people said. We haven't heard people say that they don't want maybe dining rooms and other spaces, but I think our units tend to be kind of on the smaller side, maybe not like they're often usually an open space plan. So I think our units tend to be kind of more modest in size anyways. So I think you're not seeing that. There's no differentiation of those spaces in our units. So we're not hearing that from people. Yeah.
How important is it to implement innovative approaches to enhance projects?
I think it's incredibly important. I think, I think for options, a lot of our innovation has probably been, around our financing, how we structure deals, the partners that we've been able to bring in, the kind of, even though we've been around doing it for a long time, we're one of, there's really nobody else quite like us in Canada that's delivering units and then providing that down payment support. So in spite of us being around for a long time, we're probably still innovative in a certain strange way. But I think you kind of have to keep innovating. And I think what we're going to see in the next while is increasing innovation in this space. I think, in the last few years, as in the sort of post-COVID era where costs where the cost of units have become much more expensive, and now interest rates have really increased. I think we're going to see more hybrid models like rent to own, or there's models in the UK where people are buying a portion of a unit. And I think that's the future here in this space, is that we're going to see different forms of ownership than we have, because I think that idea of owning, that $1 million unit isn't going to work for everybody. There's a lot of people who simply cannot make that work. So I think some proportional ownership, I think, is where I think there will be increasing opportunity and demand for something like that.
Agreed. Can you describe a particularly impactful or successful project that you've been involved in?
I think I would go to, our project we're just finishing right now, the Humber project. It is, it's 232 units of affordable housing. It's right across from the Up in Weston. And so it's connected to transit. And it's interesting because it's a project that it's the first market condo project in that area. And my guess is probably 30 years or more. Weston is an area that, is considered a priority neighborhood by the city. When we first started to work there, people were questioning, like, what is this community like? And we really saw great bones in that community, like really strong community, great whole section of older homes with long-term residents, great farmers market. Artscape was just finishing a rental project there and a bit of a community hub and a great high street. And we were like, this has got great bones. And, what's been interesting, and this kind of follows a bit of a trend with options, is we've often been an early mover in a community. So we were the first in the distillery district when coyotes roamed the land. We were in the Junction in 2010 before the Junction was cool and quite as, and we put 600 units into the Junction and sort of helped foster, the traffic that you see on Dundas, the foot traffic. I won't take responsibility for the car traffic, but and then Weston has been sort of similar, where we were kind of early in. We helped build a market. We helped convince people that this is a great community. It's a beautiful building that sits on top of the river. It actually looks like it's marketing images, and the views look like the marketing views. And I think it's really helped to kind of begin to revitalize that community. And I think that's one thing we're really proud about at Options, is that kind of opportunity to come in and help, I think, breathe new life into a community that, where that hopefully will serve the local community and improve the community.
How do you measure and evaluate the social impact of your organization's projects?
Yeah, well, we just completed a social impact study. So that was interesting. We had never done that in 30 years. So we went out to see, to some extent, who were our purchasers, who were we helping, and how were we helping them. And, as I mentioned before, what we found was that we had this tremendous number of purchasers who came from communities that don't typically have as strong a track record in homeownership, with 56% of them coming from BIPOC communities. We also, we learned that something like 65% of our purchasers would never have been able to buy without our down payment support. In addition to helping people to become homeowners, what we also found was that, what the kind of nice byproduct was that we had kind of created about 2,500 units of rental churn. So these units, people are moving into ownership, but it's creating 2,500. They're vacating 2,500 units of rental. So that frees up some rental, which is, a very challenging thing to do right now. And then we also found that the things that I found surprising and, we were quite delighted about in the impact study was the quality of people's lives and how they changed, the sort of levels, people reported very significant reduction in their stress levels because this dream that they thought was never going to happen, this sense of security of tenure that, they now kind of control their destiny. They can't be rent evicted. And so they have more control in their lives, and that's giving them a sense of peace and well-being and happiness. And so that was a really wonderful find out of our project, like of the social impact project.
I think it's fantastic. I mean, I read something like 76% of Canadians think that owning a home is the best investment a person can make, but 3% of those who don't already own a home have given up on any aspiration
Yeah.
to buy one. So the fact that you're positively influencing those percentages is absolutely fantastic.
That's one of the things that is, I think, the most rewarding is when we get purchasers who really had given up hope, and when they purchase. And what's interesting with some of them is that, we offer this down payment support. And so when they buy the unit, and as you mentioned, it's often a long time between the time you buy and the time you move in and you close on your unit, you actually become the owner. Oftentimes that can be, 4 years, 5 years, depending. And what we have found is that some of those people that had given up hope, but when they sign that agreement and they know they're going to become a homeowner, oftentimes they make very big behavioral changes. So where before they might have spent money on, I don't know, a Starbucks coffee every day, I'm just completely making this up. They're like, no, I'm not doing that. I'm going to grow my down payment. And so they become savers because they actually have this goal that they're working towards in 5 years, that they're going to pay out our down payment support. They're not going to take it. And that's one of the things that I just find incredibly fascinating is some of the just, once you have that kind of hope and that opportunity, how people will change how they operate. Whereas if you have no hope, you're kind of like, well, it doesn't really matter, but once you have that opportunity and that hope, I think we've seen people really shift how they spend their money, with the choices that they make. And I think that for me has been a very powerful lesson and quite eye-opening.
That's great. Now, my understanding is that in Canada, the definition of affordable housing is if, including utilities, it costs less than 30% of a household's pre-tax income. Now, is that accurate? How is it determined? Who determines it?
Yeah. That definition is a classic definition, and I think it goes back to a definition that came out of CMHC quite some time ago. If I recall correctly from my policy friends, it sort of came out in the 70s. And that's really much more probably germane to affordable rental. And then on the other side, on our side, on the ownership side, it usually would be a bit higher than that because it's really about your kind of debt service ratio with the bank. But what we use as a term now is attainable homeownership. So that's really about, when we talk about attainable homeownership, and it's now a term that's being used by the province of Ontario. It's not defined yet entirely, but we've been using this term for a while because we want to differentiate ourselves and kind of establish that we are in the affordable ownership realm versus the overall affordable housing realm, which it becomes very big and very diffuse, and people don't quite know what that means. So we talk about attainable housing and attainable home ownership to kind of really help situate where we are in the market.
In your experiences then, what would you say are the main challenges in providing attainable housing?
I think it goes back to some of the earlier comments. It's finding land in the right place where it's affordable. We can't, we're never going to buy in the downtown core. We have to be finding places in areas that are naturally more affordable. And, it's access to capital. I think that's one of the critical things is sort of, we have some of our own capital, but it's really how do you grow that and kind of continue to deliver anywhere. We'll never be able to meet the need entirely, but I think growing the sources of capital to allow for kind of further scaling up in additional units. Those are some of them. I think there's been some interesting things in Ontario with Bill 23 that have positive impacts on our ability to deliver, like some of the waivers of some of the municipal costs. Those actually, I understand that that's challenging for the municipalities, but for nonprofits trying to deliver affordable homeownership, those are big benefits that can then be passed on to the homeowners.
How do attainable housing developments impact surrounding communities, Heather?
I think in a very positive way. Like, as I mentioned, we've been oftentimes, a catalyst in a new community. So in Weston or in the Junction or in the distillery, we've often been, we're looking for places where land is more affordable so that our end price point can be more affordable. Oftentimes we're early movers and we have built markets in some cases, like in Weston, where people were, our first owners or first purchasers were a little bit suspicious. Or like, is this going to be a good community, or the school's good here, all of those kinds of things. But then once you build a building, and now what we're seeing is there's tremendous development interest in that community. And so that brings, more foot traffic to the streets, kind of make sure the schools are filled. It's bringing business to the local businesses. Like all of those things, I think are, we've often, as I said, been that kind of early mover that has helped bring other interest to a community.
Absolutely, a real trailblazer. I like that. How does affordable housing intersect with sustainability and environmental considerations?
There is a good intersection there. I think it's an important intersection. We often do in our projects, we've been quite, for many years, is introduce green energy. So we have like either PV or solar hot water in our buildings as one really kind of key piece. What we're trying to do is over the longer term, the benefits of those kinds of technologies and improved windows and various other aspects is trying to keep the cost down over the longer term. So there might be some additional costs up front in the construction of the building, but over the longer term it really provides savings for the purchaser. And that's ultimately, I think, good for affordability.
Definitely. And when I was at the housing conference a few months ago, the message was that there really is an appetite from investors for sustainable practices, or obviously financial gain as well.
Yeah.
But it's nice to know that that is a priority in motivating investment.
Mhm.
Can you share any insights into the role of advocacy and policy work in advancing the goals of affordable housing developments?
I mean, it's critical. This is a large part of what I do on a daily basis is talking to government, ensuring they understand what we can do, and what policy work could help us do more and do better, really. At the federal level, we did some work to help to build a program really done through CMHC, but we provide a lot of input that provide support to groups like ours to provide that sort of comes in alongside our capital at the beginning of a project. We've also, a lot of at the city level, they've provided deferrals of development charges, which is a significant amount of money that then has been added to what we can lend to our purchasers. So that's been a great partnership and came out of kind of advocacy work that we did and helping the city really understand, what the benefit of this kind of co-investment alongside us would be. Also working with the province in some of the changes it made in Bill 23 that really shift some of the costs and will allow us to again deliver much more affordable units. So it's quite critical in this role to be kind of constantly advocating, and looking for where are the opportunities to kind of keep our costs as low as we can, because all of that lands with the purchasers in terms of additional support that we can provide to them.
How do you see the future of real estate development in Toronto evolving, and what sort of trends or opportunities are you anticipating as a team?
I think it's an interesting moment right now. I think there was just a Globe article yesterday talking about the slowing of real estate in the near term. The fundamentals are all strong here in Toronto. I think one of the interesting things that's going to happen, and you're starting to see this already, is that there's less appetite for the downtown core right now, is what we were finding, in our kind of broad looking at the market. When you're selling at relatively high cost per square foot and the interest rates are high, the carrying cost of that unit is very high. So what we're starting to see is, the sales, at least they're in the market right now where things have been moving or were moving earlier this year, we're all in sort of, it's North York that all of a sudden is booming. So I think it's going to depend a lot on what happens with interest rates over the next while, because I think we will see this tendency towards outerlying areas in the next while and away from some of the downtown sites, just because of the price points that we're going to be hitting and the monthly cost to carry it. So I think that's where we're going to see that. And I hope I hope we'll also start to get some more maybe improvements around our transit-oriented developments, because we really, to date, haven't been as strong in that as I think we could be. And especially if we're looking at if the market is going to tend to some of these outlying areas, then I think we need to be, trying to drive it towards places where there is good transit. So those are some of the things that we've been thinking a lot about lately. And we've also been looking at, we continue to work in Toronto, but do we also start to serve some other outlying areas where, again, the price points we can serve might be a little bit lower, and just kind of serving in markets like a Brampton that we haven't served yet.
I want to sort of change gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about you and your role in our industry. What would you say has been the most rewarding part of being a strong female leader in our industry? And did you have any major challenges in breaking through the leadership glass ceiling?
I think one of the things that I appreciate most about being a female leader in this industry is that there are a lot more women in this industry than when I started out. So when I show up at events, or during COVID, I did a few participated in panels with the WLI or other groups. And it's really refreshing to see how many women are in the industry now, because when I started, it felt like there were very few women, and often they were kind of in much more junior roles. So it's exciting to see, and you've got these tremendous cast of female leaders around, and that's quite heartening. Like that, it's nice to see when I can kind of look back to the beginning of my career and see that a lot has changed, and to see the kind of enthusiasm of a lot of the young women who are in this sector, and a lot of also the women who, like, I can think of a few people who are older than me, and who've also been very supportive, and and mentored me, and also just at times were friends and willing to have a coffee and and help me sort out whatever challenge I had in front of me. So that for me is a really wonderful change that we've seen in the sector.
Just lastly then, Heather, I've got one last question for you. What advice would you give to individuals that are interested in pursuing a career in non-profit real estate development?
You probably have to have one of two sets of skills. You either have to be like a real estate person, or you need to be the kind of someone who wants to serve and sort of help and support, let's say, on the purchaser side. So like you're either that kind of very human oriented service person who wants to kind of help guide people through a process, or you probably have a set of real estate skills, because fundamentally in many ways we're doing the same things that every other group is doing. So sometimes I like to just make sure people know it's really not that different, in terms of the fundamental work. But the other sort of the advice that I often give to people when people, I meet with someone who's new in the industry, is there's lots of places to contribute in the industry. But I think it's always about, finding the intersection in that sort of Venn diagram of what you're good at, what you're interested in, and where you can contribute. And that takes a bit of work to get there, to kind of really think that through. But I think if you find that sweet spot, then that will really help you to guide yourself as you look at opportunities and find the spot where you'll really flourish. So that's my advice for up and comers, if you will.
Thank you for listening to People Who Perform, the Real Estate Careers podcast brought to you by Highview Partners, a talent search and recruitment firm focused exclusively on Canadian real estate. If your real estate team is looking to find the best next hire, or if you're ready to make the best next move in your career, then reach out to Highview Partners today. Follow us on LinkedIn and visit us at highviewpartners.ca.